with William F. Buckley, Jr. Tonight's guest, Professor Hans Morgenthau of the University of Chicago. Our topic, LBJ and the intellectual. Now, Mr. Buckley.
Hans Morgenthau is a professor of political science at the University of Chicago, which is just the beginning of my academic reality. He was born in Germany and took a law degree at the University of Frankfurt. And he taught law, but began to slide over towards political science. By the time he emigrated to America, he was ready to teach law and political science and politics. He's done practically every major university in the country, and also at the Armed Forces Staff College, the Air Arms Race. He was also a consultant at the Department of State in the late Truman years, and then at the Department of Defense for the late Johnson years. And his books are Legion, A Learned and Tension. On top of all that he does, on top of that, he does a great deal of journalism. He is all along opposed to the war in Vietnam, which struck some of his followers as unexpected, since he has over the years taken a general position based on theoretical questions involving the U.S. and the economy. But although we must undoubtedly get into the Vietnam figure, we will here primarily discuss the intellectuals and LBJ. Morgenthau has written about LBJ that he suffered mostly from believing contradictory things at one and the same time. Could you give us an example?
Well, the position which the president has taken toward Vietnam perhaps illustrates that point. I think the major problem which we are facing is that the administration has not been able to make up its mind about what it wants. Does it want a self-determination for South Vietnam? It's a risk of a communist takeover. Or does it want to stop communism at any price, even at the price of self-determination? You can't have it both ways. And I think the administration has not decided within its own mind what its objective is.
Now, in what sense has this antagonized the intellectuals?
Well, it has antagonized the intellectuals in that sense that it has confused them. It has confused the people at large. In the widespread anxiety and malaise which exists in this country. I think it is in good measure attributable to this lack of clarity as to what we are after in Vietnam. The Second World War was a clear position insofar as it protected. And so was the Korean War. But what do we want? What does
Broad charges, I'm sorry, sir. Broad charges have been staked out. You'll see how they're substantiated in just a moment.
You seem to be saying, Dr. Morgenthau, that it is distinctively a matter that irritates intellectuals. But when people use paradoxically or make their aim, getting to the fact, isn't the ambiguity of opposition in Vietnam something that would stress among intellectuals as much as like after all, we have seen Johnson's popularity slide from 65% to 43%. Surely all the people affected haven't been intellectuals.
Surely not. I mean, I'm not suggesting that only intellectuals are as I just said, there is a malaise to control that. But of course, intellectuals who are supposed to think rationally and logically are particularly perturbed by this kind of confusion when it comes to a basic issue of national politics.
Well, how then do you account for the enthusiasm of the intellectuals for Mr. Kennedy, when in fact it could be demonstrated that his own rhetoric and action were at least as a schizophrenic?
Very good question. I addressed myself to that question, I think, in 1961, because Mr. Kennedy appealed by his own personality.
Okay, hi everyone. And so today is our first class for the third week. And so let me make sure that I don't forget that we do the smart attendance for the class. So make sure that you are sharing a screen, share screen, smart attendance, and we're at the right class, so attendance, and we go to week 3, add smart attendance, and your number is 185. 185 is your smart attendance number. And so let me go back to the chat, and 185 is your number. 185 is your smart attendance number. So we got that finished. And so there you saw in the video there, the only video recording that we have of Hans J. Morgenthau. And Hans J. Morgenthau was maybe the most influential founder of international relations theory in the 20th century, at least. And so I've spoken about Hans J. Morgenthau, and I talked about his notion of nationalistic universalism, how great powers tend to cloak the output of their foreign policymaking process in broadly appealing ideological or religious symbols. And Stephen Hook, the author of your textbook, makes that point also in the book, right? I mean, he discusses Hans Morgenthau as well in the textbook. But before I do that, I want to make sure that we cover some basic intellectual concepts that I'm going to be using in the class to highlight some important points, like, for example, regarding how we do analysis of international relations. And so let me open up the one of the exercises that I wanted to highlight here, and if I can find it in the notes that I prepared. And here we see. Let me close this. Let me go back to stop share, and let me just share screen and go back to the notes. And okay, so just a second here, and levels of analysis. So Hans J. Morgenthau was one famous thinker in international relations, but there are others as well. And one important concept in explaining anything that happens in a country's behavior in international relations is this concept of different levels of cause. If I want to explain, for example, why Joseph Biden withdrew from American forces from Afghanistan after 20 years of war, let's say, you know, one of your family members, one of your parents asks you, why did the United States leave Afghanistan? If they ask you that question, you should provide a sophisticated answer. And a sophisticated, appropriate answer is going to identify more than one cause. There's always more than one causal motivating drive or factor explaining why the United States withdrew its forces from Afghanistan, or got involved in the Korean War, or fought World War II, or fought the Vietnam War. There's always more than one cause. And these causes reflect different levels or orientations or different systemic factors at work that interact with each other to explain why something happened in international relations, whether it be World War I, World War II, the Korean War, the Cold War, anything. And the first person to really express this notion of trying to explain what's going on in international relations is a man by the name of Kenneth Waltz. And Kenneth Waltz is in the tradition of Hans Morgenthau. And he wrote a book in 1954 when he was a young man, his PhD dissertation called Man, the State, and War. And I think I have, let me close this because we don't need to have that open anymore. Stop the share. Let me close the this file, and let me go back to the Word document just a second here. I want to open up the, go back to the lesson plan for today. And where's the lesson plan? I think that's, okay, yeah. So share the screen. And this is the book from 1954 called Man, the State, and War. And this book is an old book, but it's an important book. And you know it's an important book because it's still in print. You can still order it from Amazon. So in other words, people are still buying and assigning this book in class. And it's called Man, the State, and War. And Kenneth Waltz wanted to explain in his PhD dissertation, he wanted to look at and understand all of the different research and writing that had been done as to why World War II happened. Why did the Second World War happen? And Kenneth Waltz, when he was a PhD student, surveyed the literature, the published scholarly literature on the topic as to why World War II happened. And he put this literature, all the scholarly publications in 3 different categories. And he said that if you look at this literature, and let me go back to the exercise I wanted to do here. You go back to this literature and you can see that, that's not it, that some of the literature explained what happened in terms of what caused World War, the Second World War, in terms of the individual leaders, particularly the personality of Adolf Hitler. If you want to understand why World War II happened, this literature focused its analysis on the individual political leaders of Germany and the other countries as well, but particularly Hitler. If you want to understand why World War II happened, you have to understand Adolf Hitler. And that's the individual level of analysis. So if you want to understand why the United States withdrew its forces from Afghanistan, you have to know something about Joe Biden. Joe Biden is different from Donald Trump. Joe Biden is different from Barack Obama, right? But to go back to World War II, we understand why, that you need to understand, to fully understand why World War II happened, you need to understand Adolf Hitler. And this is called the individual level of analysis. Another group of literature, another focus of the literature, of another group of literature says, if you want to understand why World War II happened, you have to understand German nationalism. You have to understand what was going on inside of Germany as a political system. You have to understand what was going on inside of Germany as a state, as a community. That the Germans were going through the humiliation of defeat in World War I, and then the social stress of the Great Depression, in which at least 1/4 of the population of Germany, at least living in the cities, lost their jobs. This happened after the great inflation of the 1920s that totally destroyed people's savings because the money became worthless, as there's a tremendous astronomical inflation rate, basically eliminated everybody's money that they had saved for themselves over the years of hard work. That money became worthless. And this made Germany unhappy, discontented, and willing to support radical figures, whether they be communists or Nazis or whatever. So, and we need to understand also Germany's militaristic history and the humiliation of World War I, of the loss of World War I. So this is focusing upon state or national or domestic level factors of analysis in terms of the German social, economic, and political system. And then the third group of literature that Kenneth Waltz identified explained World War II by emphasizing the decline of Britain and the lack of a system in place in Europe and the world for debating and reconciling and addressing global disputes between the great powers of the world, like we had seen through most of the 19th century, from the end of the wars with Napoleon until World War I. There had been in place, under British superior influence, over most other actors after they defeated Napoleon, that there had been an informal institutional arrangement called the Concert of Europe. And the Concert of Europe began at the end of the Napoleon Wars and continued until World War I breakout, whereby the great powers of Europe would get together, and when they had conflicts, and they had conflicts, sometimes intense conflicts, they would come together and resolve their disputes or come to an agreement under the overarching power of Great Britain, and particularly the British Navy. Right, the British Navy controlled the oceans, and that is a great dominance factor for the British to tip the scales in favor of pushing other countries to come to an agreement over their disputes. And the Japanese and the Americans were witnesses to this process, and Stephen Hook describes that in the book. And the Americans would tend to cooperate with the British, and the Japanese would eventually challenge the system. But basically, the Americans and the British worked somewhat together so that the other countries of great powers of the world, like the Russian Empire, Germany, France, the Austrians, they knew that if they made an enemy of the British, they were going to be in big trouble, because the British power was such that if they're going to fight a war with the British, they might well lose. So they had a strong incentive to cooperate. And so the point is that this explanation of why World War II happened emphasizes that Britain was in decline and Germany was rising before World War I. World War I happened. Britain won the war, but it was terribly weakened. And the Americans were not willing to step in and play an important role to replace the British. As the British Empire became weaker and weaker and weaker, the Americans were not willing to play an important role in Europe, even though they entered World War I at the very end in 1917. And because the Americans entered, the Germans gave up. Because the Americans were tremendously wealthy. They were untouched pretty much by the war so far. And then the Americans came in on the side of the British and the French. And even though the Germans beat the Russian Empire, the Russians gave up. They knew they could not win. But then the Americans, after World War I was over, they somewhat, from the government's point of view, the American government washed its hands. It decided not to be actively involved on a political level in organizing and cajoling and pushing the countries of Europe to cooperate and regulate their relations. And so this emphasizes the breakdown of informal institutions, the role of informal or formal institutions in explaining why World War II came about. There was a League of Nations. Some of you who have studied Introduction to International Relations know about how the Americans had this idea of creating an international organization that would be this new regulator for resolving international conflicts. And they called it the League of Nations, the League of Nations. And this was an American idea, and they got the British and the French to agree to it, and the Germans and the Japanese also joined it. And then the Americans didn't join the League of Nations, even though it was their idea, even though it was their incentive that President Woodrow Wilson of the United States promoted. The American US Congress, the Senate of the US Congress, one of the two houses, refused to approve the treaty to allow the Americans to join the League of Nations. So the point is that there was no longer leadership of international institutions to assist in the regulation of disputes between the great powers after World War I. And as a result, countries became more and more focused upon their own interests and competing with each other without being motivated, sufficiently motivated to cooperate with each other, because nobody was really pushing them to cooperate. No overarching, powerful, hegemonic power was pushing them to cooperate. So this focuses upon the international system, that the international system was becoming more and more disorganized, more and more anarchic. And so that's what Kenneth Waltz found in his study of man, the state, and war, is that the literature, and he's writing not long after the end of the Second World War, the literature on why this horrible catastrophe called World War II happened could be broken down in terms of its emphasis on each of these three different levels of analysis, levels of causal analysis, levels of causation. And what did Kenneth Waltz conclude? He concluded that, guess what? Any explanation for why World War II happened needs to include elements of all three levels of causal analysis to explain why something happened, whether it be World War II or World War I or the Korean War or the Cold War or the end of the Cold War or the invasion of Iraq or the invasion, anything requires an explanation that you have to include. Remember, from this perspective, that any effort to try to explain something that happened in international relations should include factors or include elements from all three different levels of analysis, right? You can't focus on just one. They're all necessary, but they're not individually sufficient. You have to have explanations from all three different levels of analysis, and ideally you have to show how they're interrelated with each other. So, right, you can't explain World War II unless you understand Adolf Hitler. But you can't understand Adolf Hitler unless you understand German nationalism. And you can't understand German nationalism and Adolf Hitler unless you understand the breakdown of the concert of Europe in the early 20th century and the outbreak of World War I. If that breakdown had not happened, then World War I would not have happened and Adolf Hitler would not have happened. And the British tried in 1914, they tried to balance and keep Russia from going to war with Austria. But by that time, Germany thought it was so powerful compared to the British that they thought they could knock out Russia and France before Britain got involved in the war. Because Britain, was separated from Europe by the English Channel, that they could, Britain didn't have a big army, but the Germans have an army and they could beat up the Russians and beat up the French, and the war would be pretty much over before the British could enforce its wishes on the different actors. And maybe that was wishful thinking, maybe that was foolish thinking, it probably was. But the point is that Germany became more and more powerful after it unified in the 1870s. Germany became more and more powerful, so that by the start of World War I, its economy, its manufacturing economy was bigger than Britain's economy. Britain had more finance and banks because of the British Empire and British commercial and financial interests, but the British the German industrial capacity was already bigger than Britain's industrial capacity. And of course, the Industrial Revolution had begun in Britain in the 18th century. So that's why I would like you now to provide an individual level factor for causal analysis. And I think since we only have 11 people in the group, I'm going to just break this down into 3 different groups and ask you to come up with an explanation as to why the United States withdrew from Afghanistan. In group 1, I want you to provide an individual level factor for causation analysis of why the United States withdrew its forces from Afghanistan after 20 years. Group 2, I would like you to provide a state level factor of causal analysis for why the United States withdrew from Afghanistan 20 years after invading. And group 3, I would like you to provide international system level factor for causation analysis for explaining why the United States withdrew from Afghanistan last month. and of course the Afghan government collapsing as a result. So what I need to do now is divide you into 3 different groups. And so divide you into breakout rooms, and we'll assign you automatically. And so we have, these are the 3 groups, and I'll rename you individual level of analysis. And yes, in group 2, I'll call you state level of analysis. Yes, in room 3, I'll call you international system level of analysis. Okay, and so let me open the groups and ask you to go to your groups and come up with an explanation as to why the United States withdrew from Afghanistan, emphasizing group 1, the individual level of analysis, group 2, the state level of analysis, and group 3, emphasizing the international system level of analysis. And so let me put that, make a 3 there. And please go to join the rooms. So please join your rooms. Please join your rooms. And I will flip a coin, and let me see which rooms you're in. And heads, it's the first 2 people will be chosen to speak, and it's tails. So it's the last person each group will speak. So the person that will speak for this group for individual level analysis is Eugene Kim. You will speak for group 1. Chun Hyo Kyung, or Ki Mi Ro, whoever that is. Chun Hyo Kyung, and then we have a dash here. Camera. Oh, camera. A camera will speak for the state level analysis, group 2, and Timan will speak for international system level analysis. So prepare your speakers to come up with a group explanation as to why the United States withdrew from Afghanistan. Group 1 emphasizing the individual personalities and thinking and worldviews of the individual personal decision makers. State level analysis focusing upon American nationalism and Afghanistan nationalism. And level 3, explain it in terms of the international system and what's going on in terms of the international system that caused the United States to withdraw from Afghanistan. And heads, I will do an individual level of analysis. Tails, I'll do a group, a state, or international system level. So let me flip a coin. And it is tails. So heads, I'm state level. Tails, I am international system level. And I'm state level. So I will write a state level explanation. And keep in mind, all of them are right, but all of them have to be supplemented with the others. So any explanation has to include factors at all 3 levels of analysis. So please prepare your statements. Okay. And so back to the breakout rooms. So let's see who's going to speak. I think, okay, so who's going to speak first? So heads is group room 1 will speak first. And it is tails. So tails, it is heads, it's group 2 will speak first. And it's heads. So Chon Hyo Kyung, what did your group come up with? Chon Hyo Kyung. Chon Hyo Kyung for state level of analysis. Where's Chon? Well, Chon Hyo Kyung is nowhere to be found. Well, then let's see who else. What about Sally or Jaewon Kim? Again, one of the tasks here is to help give you an opportunity to practice your English. So let me flip the coin here, and it is Sally. I can't hear you, Sally. Oh, sorry. I forgot to close the breakout room. So you got 1 minute. Okay, so let's do this again because I have to have you out of the breakout rooms in order to choose the group to speak first. So let me flip a coin, and heads will be individual level first will speak first, and it's tails. So and it's group 2. So group 2, state level of analysis. Chon Hyo Kyung, what did your group come up with as a preliminary explanation at the state level analysis for explaining why the US left Afghanistan?
Today, the China is competing with the US in a variety of ways, such as strengthening conventional power and weakening the US alliance. Sorry, I don't know the definition. This is because achieving a strategic deadlock alone cannot achieve its own goal of achieving hegemony in the Asia Pacific region. And also, I think the withdrawal from the Afghanistan is caused because USA need more money. It's short of money because of the Iraq war and Afghanistan war. And I heard that it's $9 trillion. And it's not enough to compete with China.
Now that's interesting. It sounds like, yeah, you're right. It's difficult to separate the factors at these 3 different levels of analysis because they bleed into each other. Sounds like, though, if you're focusing on competition with China, that's an international system level factor of analysis. Now, you did mention there's not enough money. And so the American economy is declining relative. Yeah, so that highlights the American economy is declining relative to China, which affects the US competition with China. But the American economy and its size, its performance, that's a domestic level factor of analysis, right? And so you're right. It's difficult to separate factors at these three different levels, and we shouldn't, because they are interrelated with each other. But if you're going to focus upon competition with China becoming perceived as more important, I would like to, well, let's go to the third group. Timon, how do you think competition with China would cause the United States to withdraw from Afghanistan?
Well, it's a pretty hard question.
What are your thoughts then? What statement did you have to make?
So you mean what I said on the internet, what we thought on the international level?
Yeah.
Or
Yeah.
okay. So in our opinion, we were more thinking about the side of the Islamic State as to where they were thinking to have the more diplomatic relations with the Taliban, because they are more a movement who are more interested in just being in their own country, being Afghanistan, and the Islamic State is more globally interested. So I think they would want to do business with bad people to fight the worst people.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, again, it's difficult to separate factors at different levels of analysis. It sounds to me though like you're talking about that the American involvement in Afghanistan was radicalizing the Islamic world as the Americans continue to drop lots of bombs and kill people. Most recently they claim they attacked a car bomb that was going to attack the Americans leaving. After the first attack, a second attack was being planned, and it turns out they killed the wrong people, a family of 10 people with 7 children. That's going on all of the time for 20 years. And this is radicalizing the Muslim world. There's 1.6 billion Muslims in the world, stretching from West Africa out to the Philippines, not counting the Muslim diaspora elsewhere. And they're being radicalized. So typically though, when we talk about international system level of analysis, we focus on state relations. And so I think someone would typically expect that what you're highlighting is an important point, right? That political Islam is becoming more intense and radical because of the American involvement in the Middle East, violent involvement in the Middle East. That could somehow, but it's hard to say how that, for example, threatens America's friends, American governments in Saudi Arabia or Egypt. I struggle with this too, Timon. I don't have, I'm just sharing my thoughts with you. I'm struggling with these issues as well. I mean,
Yeah.
The Americans do everything they can to keep the Saudi royal family in power. I don't see, there was the Arab Spring 10 years ago, but the Arab Spring it didn't threaten America's main ally, Saudi Arabia, the Saudi royal family. And then when the Islamists elected Morsi in Egypt, the Egyptian military overthrew him, and the Americans support this dictator Sisi. And he's been there for years now. I'm just trying to understand how radicalization of political Islam is somehow going to challenge the political status quo in the Middle East. Is it going to erase borders? It generates terrorist attacks, but these terrorist attacks, they're bad for media reports and innocent people get killed, but they don't really, they don't, what government are they going to overthrow? How are they going to change the international political system? And if any way, you might say radicalization of Islam is more dangerous for China because China has a border with Afghanistan, a small border, like a 100-mile-long border on Wardak province. But they have a border with Afghanistan, and they have a significant Muslim population, about 40 million Muslims in China, that the Chinese government is trying to forcibly assimilate. The Uyghurs in particular, the Turkic Uyghurs are a Turkic Muslim people that the Chinese are trying to forcibly erase through cultural assimilation. So you could say they share a border with Afghanistan, and the Islamic State could use Afghanistan as a basing area to attack and destabilize the Chinese control over Xinjiang Uyghur Turkic Muslims there in Xinjiang province. But I mean, totalitarian states, they suppress they have all the resources for controlling and suppressing those things in very brutal ways. And so I don't know. I mean, I think that typically, though, somebody talking about international system level analysis would focus on that the rise of China is something which the Americans need to focus more attention on, and they want to be able to do that by moving resources from the Middle East and deploying more of them to Asia. But even as I say that, I mean, I'm just wondering how much it really costs for the Americans to kill and bomb in Afghanistan, can continue to do it like they did for the last 20 years. Like, how much does it make a difference? How much are the Americans really going to cut back their resources in the Middle East now that they're out of Afghanistan? How much are they really going to cut back and move those resources to Asia? First off, I don't think they're going to cut back very much. Okay, they closed some base in Afghanistan, but they're not going to leave elsewhere. And they'll probably strengthen places where they're already, like they want to go back to Somalia. I'm struggling with this, because most Americans, they didn't really pay attention to what was going on in Afghanistan. Yeah, every once in a while, an American soldier got killed once or twice a month. But so what? I mean, if you're an American soldier in Afghanistan, you're probably safer than you are living in an American big city with all the crime and guns there. I mean, that's what Donald Rumsfeld said when he was Secretary of Defense. Yeah, so what? You lose a few men every year in Afghanistan. What is the murder rate? How many people die in the United States in any big American city every year? Isn't it worth paying that price to keep America? So I'm still trying to figure out what was going on in the Biden administration consideration about what they thought would happen if the status quo. I mean, they would have to keep fighting, and they think that basically the Islamists in Afghanistan and throughout the Middle East, including Central Asia, into India, Pakistan, Philippines, Africa, that they're going to become more and more radical while the Americans are continuing to kill and bomb and kill Afghanis. That's a long-term prospect. But when you read the media reports, that's the way they talk. That it's because America wants to focus more attention on China and Russia. But I don't see how the American. I mean, we already talked about how the American government, the Congress, increased the American military budget by another $40 billion, more than Joe Biden requested, to $740 billion. They didn't cut the American military budget. They didn't keep it the same. They raised it another $40 billion after the Americans are already leaving Afghanistan. Why are they raising the military budget if they were leaving Afghanistan to save money? So I'm not certain. You see, this is an important point when we talk about state level of analysis. There are forces at work that go beyond any individual like Joe Biden or Vladimir Putin or Xi Jinping or Angela Merkel. There are forces at work that reflect these vast vested interests involving millions of people who got their careers, got their jobs, built their identities, their incomes, their careers around the status quo, and they continue to ask for and demand for more and more resources collectively, because that's what organizations do. Organizations always try to expand to get more resources and more influence and more control, because that's good for the organization and it's good for the careers of the people in the organization. And that's what Hans Morgenthau was emphasizing, I think, in his work, in his theory of classical realism. He was emphasizing, he didn't say it explicitly, other people studying Morgenthau, because Morgenthau died 40 years ago, but that he was emphasizing the role of bureaucratic vested interests in driving state behavior. I mean, you have a big army and big suppliers for that army, that military, and the pride and the dignity and the glory and the history, and those vested interests are going to continue to play a role shaping the foreign policy making process in the United States. And that's the critical point that we want to emphasize in terms of the reading for this week, right? That prior to World War II, the US did not have a big, vast national security, military, industrial complex. It didn't have one. It was small until it got involved in World War II. So for the first 170 years of US history, there wasn't a huge military. The Americans fought the Indians, but the Indians were nothing. They're like, the Americans fighting the terrorists in the Middle East. They killed a soldier every once in a while, but it meant nothing other than appealing to American pride and American glory and the West and Clint Eastwood and cowboys and Indians and American Hollywood and the romantic images. But until World War II, the Americans were not like the Europeans and not like the Japanese and other countries that have this tradition of big militaries, the glorification of the aristocracy, the Yangban in Korean, the military Junker class. The Americans didn't have that. But then they got it during World War II, and World War II happened, and then almost immediately when the war was over, the Americans started cutting back their military to go back into what they were before. A small military. All of those soldiers that were fighting in World War II went back home, and the Americans were unprepared when Kim Il-sung ordered the North Korean army to invade the South. The American military was just a joke at that point, just 5 years after World War II. And that's why they almost lost. And then they responded to the Korean War, and they built up this vast military industrial complex during the Cold War to carry out containment of the Russian version of Nazi Germany in their eyes, the Soviet Union. And they think they won that. And that vast containment era military industrial complex has not been dismantled. It's just continued to grow and grow and grow and grow. And then it uses the attacks of terrorists to say, we got to grow some more. We got to grow some more. The rise of China, we got to grow some more. I mean, I was listening to one radio report this morning. I told you one news report said America has 516 military bases around the world. This report I heard this morning said, no, it's got between 800 and 1,000, depending upon how you count a base. So there's between 800 and 1,000 American military deployments around the planet. The Americans have been fighting so-called counterterrorism campaigns in 85 countries over the last 20 years. That's half of the world's states. It's just growing and growing and growing and growing and growing and feeds on itself politically and economically. And that's a state-level factor of analysis. Then you got Joe Biden. Well, let's hear what Group 1 says. So, Eugene Kim, what is your individual level of analysis? Why did the United States pull out of Afghanistan from the point of view of the people involved, the individual decision makers involved? Eugene Kim?
Yeah.
Kim?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, so first of all, we thought Joe Biden didn't want any more of the American boys to be sacrificed, so he didn't want to send their young generations to Afghanistan. And other reason was that Joe Biden didn't want to continue the conflict in Middle East, so he wanted to close the book of the fightings in Middle East and focus more for the China, because he thought China is the new enemy, and China is much more stronger than Middle East.
I mean, if I wanted to be really Machiavellian, you know, if I want to believe that basically America has to, well, I'm repeating myself, you know, in terms of whether or not the Americans believe that basically political Islam is more of a problem for China because there's 40 million Muslims in China, and political Islam threatens the Chinese domination of those people. And so the Americans want to get out of Afghanistan so that the Muslims don't focus so much on US, but they focus more on the Russians and the Chinese. You know, it's because the Russians dominate Kazakhstan, Turkmenistan, Kyrgyzstan, Kazakhstan, and Turkmenistan. Stalin and Lenin created those countries. And then, of course, China dominates Xinjiang. You know, the Uyghur nationalists, they call that area Turkestan. That whole area is Turkestan. It was called Turkestan in the 19th century. And then Stalin and Lenin, they came up with Kazakhstan and Turkmenistan and Uzbekistan and so on. And I in 1995 in the summer, I was in Bulgaria, and I decided I wanted to go study Turkish for a few weeks in Ankara in Turkey. So I took a bus from Bulgaria and I went to the University of Ankara in Turkey and studied at their summer language program at the Tumac Institute. And so I took an introductory Turkish class. And in that introductory Turkish class, there was a woman who claimed that she was the wife of the self-declared Chechen foreign minister. There was a Palestinian guy, and there was a Pakistani woman whom I got to know really well. It was really interesting. And then there was a young woman about your age who said she was from Doğu Turkestan. And Doğu in Turkish means east. So she was a Uyghur nationalist from China studying in Ankara, Turkish. Because it's a Turkic world. And she said, no, I'm from Do. She didn't say I'm from Xinjiang. She didn't say I'm from China. She said, I'm from Doğu Turkestan, East Turkestan. And that's what the Uyghur nationalists and the Islamists call it. So did the Americans believe that the pan-Islamic nationalists in Central Asia, in what they called Khorasan, that was that region's name when Genghis Khan conquered in the 13th century, it was called Khorasan. It means land of the sun. I know the sun rises in the east. And then it was called Khorasan. The Americans believe that basically pan-Islamists are going to rise up and destabilize the whole area, and that's going to really challenge China. So the Americans should get out after they help make the problem worse. I'm just speculating here. But, Joe Biden, I mean, again, the situation is different from Vietnam. You heard Hans Morgenthau talk about the Vietnam War. The Americans do not have a military draft. Anybody who's fighting in Afghanistan or Iraq, they voluntarily joined the military as a career move. They were not drafted the way they were drafted to fight in the American Army and the American military in the Vietnam War. No, they all volunteered. The way British soldiers and sailors volunteered to join the British Navy and the British Army during the glorious 19th century of British hegemony. It was a volunteer military. So Joe Biden, sacrificing people. I mean, people are not made to join. They join the military because they think they want a career. They want the benefits. They want the opportunities. If you join the Army, if you join the American military and you serve your full term and you don't have any problems, the American government will pay for your college tuition when you leave to go to college. I mean, my nephew did that. He joined the Marines. He went to Afghanistan, and the American government pays for his college tuition. And he can go to special hospitals if he gets sick and doesn't have to pay for the rest of his life. And, he's doing okay. I don't know if he saw any danger. He was in Afghanistan. I don't know if he killed anybody, but he doesn't look like he's mentally messed up. Yeah, some people get mentally messed up, but most don't. Most do not. So it's kind of a mystery still to me as to what was the problem that the Biden administration saw. That basically they thought that basically, was it because they thought Donald Trump had made the commitment in negotiations in early last year with the Taliban for the Americans to get out. And the Taliban said, okay, we won't attack you anymore because you promised to leave by May 1st, 2021. Donald Trump loses the election in November 2020, and Joe Biden inherits that promise that the Trump administration made to the Taliban. He says, well, we can't get out by May 1, but we'll get out by September 11, 2021. If he changes, if he throws out Donald Trump's promise, if he just tears it up, how is that going to look to the whole world, including the Taliban and the rest of the world, if Joe Biden just tears up Donald Trump's promise that he made? If Donald Trump had not made that promise, would the US have stayed in Afghanistan under Biden? I don't know. But Joe Biden, remember, Joe Biden is a lifelong politician. He is a master at maintaining personal political power. He is not a vision-driven politician. He's a professional politician, which means he's always focused on winning elections, And if he tore up Donald Trump's promise from February 2020 to get out of Afghanistan, it would have undermined his reelection in 2024 for a second term. It would undermine the Democratic Party in 2022, and then in the congressional elections in November 2022, and in the next presidential elections in 2024. I think that's it. Thank you very much for allowing me to try to figure out these questions during the class time. Why did he do that? It's because he's concerned about what it would happen if he disregarded Donald Trump's promise. Because Trump's probably going to run for re-election next year in 2024. And he's already calling his opponents warmongers, even though he's not a peaceful guy. I think that's it. When I understand Joe Biden in terms of individual level of analysis, when I understand what's going on in the United States with Trump and the American elections, I think that's the main explanation. It's not the rise of China. Because China's going to move into Afghanistan. They're already making negotiations with the Taliban. They want access to Afghanistan's resources. Afghanistan is a main source of lithium for batteries and computers and smartphones. Afghanistan has tremendous resources. They want Afghanistan for the Belt and Road Initiative to make routes to get to Europe for Chinese goods. The Chinese are going to move in, like they're in Pakistan. That's it. So I think a primary explanation as to why the US is leaving Afghanistan has to do with those election issues. That Joe Biden was boxed in. He could not just rip up Trump's promise because Trump's friends and allies and Trump would attack him as the warmonger president, as the one who is sacrificing, even though it's not going to make any really difference in terms of America's foreign policy costs. Like I told you, they're even increasing the American military budget over what Biden wanted. Wow. Thank you. That's it. I bet you that's it. I'm gonna have to research that. I'm gonna have to research that. I'm gonna have to write about this because I told you I have to write papers too, like you do. And I got to come up with, smart, interesting things to say and prove them. And I think that's it. So I would emphasize factors at these levels of analysis, individual and state level of analysis in the United States. This is not driven by the rise of China, because China is going to rise more as a consequence of US leaving Afghanistan. This is important. The Americans don't see a terrible threat from external actors. They see a problem with China, but even overall, the I mean, the American foreign policy is running on autopilot, with these vast bureaucratic vested interests driving this process, which is and then American nationalism plays a role, because Donald Trump made a promise in February 2020 that we were getting out by May 1, 2021. And that's why the Taliban stopped attacking and killing American soldiers, although they continue to attack Afghanistan soldiers, of course. But they didn't attack Americans anymore. Okay. So, and that brings us back to let me see, do I have an exercise plan here in terms of something to vote on after all this discussion? Let me see if I go to American foreign policy and vote.
Yeah, I think there was a vote available.
Oh yeah, but that's on something else. We'll come back to that later. Okay, so speaking of papers and assignments and the like, you do have a paragraph due tomorrow on to South Koreans, American soft power is critically important for America's world influence. And so, and that relates to American soft power, that American hegemony and influence is different from the old hegemonies and power and domination of Germany or the Soviet Union, because people love America. They love American culture. They love American economics. They love American money. They love American democracy. And they love American diversity. And that's a big advantage that America has over China, because China is a nation state with a proud, glorious culture, but it is a culture that is emphasizing Chinese supremacy, Han Chinese, Confucian supremacy. You can say America has white supremacy, yeah, but America is pretty diverse, right? Only 60%, 55, 60% of Americans call themselves white. The rest are Hispanic, African American, Asian American. I mean, Asian Americans are the fastest growing minority. China's a one-party communist totalitarian state. Boo! They love American democracy. The world loves America's culture, America's openness, American culture, including music. I mean, everybody raps. Everybody does rap music. I mean, that was created by African Americans in America and expanded around the whole world. So you have Belgian rappers, Korean rappers, Russian rappers, Chinese rappers. Are you pro or con on that? And so you should submit that paragraph by tomorrow so that I can write comments on it and send it back to you. And then we'll have a class debate on it. And then we have another assignment, which I already posted, which is the midterm. And this is due, what, 4 weeks? Let me see, here's the camera. I don't want to split that. Just a second, I wanted to, okay, so do the share screen. And so it's due October 9. So October 9 is 3 weeks from this Saturday. 3 weeks from this coming Saturday. Let me make sure I'm sharing the screen here, because I sometimes forget to do that. So here is the midterm assignment. So please respond to this statement. The rise of Donald Trump to election as US president was primarily a consequence of the United States of America becoming overextended in its foreign policy commitments. And so that was how I wrote my statement. I told you I would prepare a statement. Let me read to you what I wrote. The rise of Trump shows that the US has become overextended in its extensive international commitments, that beginning since the Cold War. As a consequence, the US economy has gone through far-reaching changes that have pushed those Americans threatened by globalization to support protectionists and Trump's America First strategy. Their militancy and hostility of Trump supporters to the increasing diversity of American society as a consequence of the US's far-reaching international commitments now threatens American democracy. So America's become very diverse, partly because of refugees coming to America from all over the world, often as a consequence of American wars. Tens of thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands of Afghanistan people will come now and live in the United States because they're fleeing Afghanistan. Hundreds of thousands of Vietnamese people came and fled the United States after the Americans lost the Vietnam War. America has to have good relations with the rest of the world, including allowing people to emigrate to the United States from Africa, from Asia, from Europe. And for people like me and people like you, that's wonderful. We love globalization. We love diversity. Our careers are tied up with globalization. Here I'm teaching to you in English at a Korean university. You're studying in English. Yay, globalization! But much of the population is threatened by that globalization because for whatever reason, they don't like it. Often they don't like it because they're not doing well in it, because they can't learn foreign languages. They're not very smart. They don't come from prosperous, wealthy families that could give them advantages in going to elite schools and making networks and connections that will then benefit their careers. There are a lot of people who see the increasing number of Asians and Africans in America as a threat to America, their understanding of what is a good natural American is, which is a European American. And they're losing, in terms of their income. More and more of the money goes to those people that can exploit and participate in a globalizing world economy, like you and me, who speak English. You speak English so well, and maybe another language, right? Your career, the future for you is an oyster, right? You will have an international career. You will really love globalization. But what about those people that you know back home who, they couldn't learn a foreign language? They're not very smart. But they remember how, 50 years ago, you didn't have to have a college degree to live a middle-class life. In the United States, if you don't have a college degree, you are going to be in a difficult situation in terms of being able to compare yourself favorably with people that do have a college degree. If you don't have a college degree, you're not going to make a lot of money, probably. You're going to be very lucky if you can afford a house, even if you don't have a college degree. And for Americans, that's just considered to be natural, that every American should have the right to own their own Jeep, their own house. That's part of the American dream. And that's becoming more and more difficult for people that cannot speak a second foreign language and who do not have a bachelor's degree from a university. So this is what I wrote. Those people are threatened. Their militancy and hostility to the increasing diversity of American society as a consequence of the US's far-reaching international commitments now threatens American democracy. I mean, Trump is a fascist. I'm not saying that to insult him. He's an authoritarian populist. But he didn't have enough support to do what he wanted to do domestically. I mean, there was a book that came out yesterday that the American military commanders told the American military that they must not listen to Donald Trump when he gives an order. They must contact him, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Milley, before doing anything that Donald Trump had told them to do. They were really concerned. I mean, I can show it to you, right? Well, I'll show it to you later, but it goes on here. So he's a threat to American democracy, and that's how Joe Biden can justify doing what he's doing, right? In terms of him wanting to win elections, Joe Biden, have to do this in order to make sure that we preserve American democracy. He says those terms. He says that we have to be competitive. We have to show the world that we can address our problems so that the Chinese model does not appear more attractive to people. Threatens American democracy. Afghanistan nationalism also is too costly to continue to suppress. So the Biden administration withdrew in order to devote more American resources to American domestic constituencies and international allies. But I don't expect the Americans to cut back on their international commitments because they took their military out of Afghanistan. I mean, Biden did make statements about how 1% of the American population is in military, serves in the military. And that 1% pays a price. But most of that 1%, they're not unhappy about America's international involvement. Like I told you, most of the people who serve in America's military are not experiencing traumatic stress syndrome. And even if they did get involved in fighting, like my nephew, I don't see any evidence that most of them are, some of them, there's a lot of comments about how American veterans commit suicide, but compare that with the suicide rate in the rest of the United States. So please critique that statement that the rise of Trump is primarily a consequence of the United States of America becoming overextended in international foreign policy commitments. So it should be 500 words in length. That does not include the footnotes or the title or your name or the references. That's just the text. Again, as always, no more than 10% of any homework should consist of quoted text. So if your paper is 500 words long, there should not be more than 50 words of quoted text, because 10% of 500 is 50. And make sure you use and cite information from at least 3 different chapters, from chapters 1 through 6 of the course textbook. So you can do more research. You can use other sources, but make sure you use and cite information from at least 3 different chapters, from 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 of the first 6 chapters in the book that we're covering by the midterm week, that you use and cite information from at least 3 of them. Okay? And then you'll submit that by October 9, 3 weeks from this Saturday. And then I will write comments on the midterm using the track function. Let me show you, right? The track function. So if I go here and show you what the track function is. So we go to track function, and I turn on the track function review, turn it on, and you go like this. If I go explain to analyze, right? You can see how I substitute the word analyze for explain, and the track function shows you what I crossed out. So I'll go through and write comments in your paper in the track function, this track function, and then send it back to you. And then I will send it back to you. And then you're going to meet with me on Zoom during the week of week 8, during the midterm week. You're going to meet with me over the computer system on Zoom individually, and I'm going to talk to you about your midterm paper and my comments on it. Okay? And then you're going to rewrite the paper, and then you're going to submit the paper for a final draft, a final grade by, what did I say, Saturday, 30 October, and I'll put a grade on it. Okay? So, yeah, we were talking about this last week as well, that, one way when we say Hans Gurgenthal said, thou shalt not underextend, thou shalt not overextend, and thou shalt not allow a lesser ally to make policy for you. What does it mean to overextend? How do you know if the country overextended? Overextension means that the country has made too many international commitments that its political system domestically will not support anymore. And that varies from country to country. But how do you know if the American political system is not willing to support those international commitments? Polarization. Polarization between those sections of society that love globalization, that love international commitments, that benefit from it, like me and you, and those sections of society that feel threatened from globalization due to increasing homeland diversity, increasing global orientation requirements. If you want to, like I said, if you want to be successful in the 21st century American economy, you have to have a bachelor's degree. And only like maybe a third of American adults have a bachelor's degree. So that means most American adults over 18 do not have a bachelor's degree. Not to mention speak a second foreign language like you all do. I mean, you're taking this class in English. You're amazing. You speak your home language, and you can work in English. That's great for you. You are benefiting from globalization. You're going to benefit from it. But most of the world is not like us. They're afraid of all of these foreigners coming to live in our country, and all of these companies building their factories in other countries because the labor is cheap. So people without college degrees have to work at McDonald's because they can't make more money working at a manufacturing factory, because that manufacturing factory moved to China or Vietnam or South Korea or Brazil, where they can pay people, you know, one quarter what they pay the United States workers. So if you have any questions, you can always ask. Okay, so let me go back to talk about the notes here. I want to make sure I cover some of the notes, so make sure I share the screen. And yeah, so this notion of American exceptionalism, it's somehow American influence around the world. It's not considered to be imperialism and colonialism the way when Germany conquered Europe, that was German imperialism, or the way the Soviet Union, when it dominated Poland and Ukraine and other countries, that was Russian imperialism. No, American influence is different, because America is exceptional. America is democratic and liberal in capitalism and democracy. And of course, and that, of course, is, you know, Hans Morgenthau would say, every country that's expanding their influence believes collectively that its expansion of its influence in the rest of the world, it's good for not only them, it's good for everybody in the whole world. And they all claim that. Napoleon, Hitler, Stalin, they all claim that to be true. So as I mentioned, US pretty much focused on its own affairs in North America, expanding into the West, fighting the Indians, expanding out to California, until they got involved in the First World War at the very end in 1917, because they decided they didn't want the Germans to win. And they wanted to help the British. And the Americans had been expanding earlier in the 1890s, at the end of the 19th century, when they defeated the Spaniards and took the Philippines and acquired dominance over Central America. But these are weak countries. They dominated Central American countries like Haiti and Nicaragua, typically because they owed money. They owed money to American banks and businesses, and these countries could not pay back their debts. So the Americans would get involved and occupied Haiti, for example, until the 1930s, because Haiti was bankrupt and the Americans wanted the Haitians to pay their debts to American companies and other companies. These are weak, small actors. It's not like fighting the Germans or the Soviets or the Chinese. So that's not going to have a big impact on America's lifestyle and America's thinking, even though the Americans are always involved in some kind of war or conflict with, whether it be American Indian tribes in the 19th century, as the Americans are moving out to California, or they're getting involved in Central America. These are small, low-cost military operations. So the American military didn't have to be big and strong in the 19th century. And as I told you, it didn't really get big and strong until the Second World War, and particularly the Cold War. So that's highlighted in this chapter of the Hook textbook, that America focused upon expanding and organizing itself, dealing with the divisions and conflicts within the United States, slavery, what to do with slavery, overcoming that conflict issue through war. The US Constitution was set up to create a continental power, a continental actor, a really big country, right? A land-based power using democratic instruments to create a continental-sized state. And the US Constitution was set up to expand. I mean, the Americans knew that they were going to expand and add more states to the United States of America. And the US Constitution in part reflected that awareness. The American states agreed to, that founded the United States, agreed to give up much of their sovereignty so that they could organize a continental economy with one currency, one monetary policy, and then and also to build infrastructure, right? Infrastructure, well, railroads that would stretch across the continent. Congress was considered to be the most important actor in the minds of the people that were writing the US Constitution, not the president, the Congress. The president, at the end of the 18th century, the president was supposed to be the war leader during time of war. But again, it was early modern warfare. It wasn't mass industrial warfare. It was basically the US president would become the commanding general of the US armies. And in peacetime, the American president, his job was to preside. The president presides sort of like the way the King of England at the time was the war leader, but also he was not ultimately the most powerful actor making domestic policy in Great Britain. It was the Parliament. Even by the end of the 18th century, the Parliament was predominant in making British domestic policy. But the king was supposed to facilitate that process of Parliament making policy, however it was necessary to do that. The US State Department, you had to have a foreign ministry, but it was a small organization, right? The US wasn't going to be involved in conflicts between Paris and London, except when Paris and London interfere with America doing business, because Americans want to make money. That's what America's founded on, as a desire for freedom, to do what you want to do, to worship your own God the way you want to worship God, but also to make your life better. And that means pursuing happiness, which means basically pursuing prosperity, money. And so the Americans are focused on international relations from the point of view of trade, of doing business. And they would get into wars, again, a second war with Britain and an undeclared war with France, when France and Britain, while they're at each other's throats in the early 19th century in the Napoleon Wars, they became in conflict with the United States because they didn't want the Americans to trade with their enemy. And that made the Americans fight the British in the War of 1812. And before the War of 1812, they had an undeclared war with the French, even though the French had helped the Americans fight against the British in the Independence War. So the Americans hired consular officers overseas to protect American merchant ships and trade. By 1820, the US was really prosperous. It was the fourth richest country per capita in the world, all right, after the European countries. And people knew that the Americans, they have this whole continent that the British have the north in Canada, but the Americans have the rest. And they have to deal with the Spanish in the south. The Spanish were weak. And so the American expansionism was focused upon North America. They wanted to be able to, expand and for purposes of economic interest. And so you can see the Americans are concerned about the British and the French not being happy about losing their empires in North America beginning in the 18th century, and maybe want to come back and take it, or maybe take it from the Spanish and add it to the French or the British Empire. So the Americans in the early 19th century begin to declare that, that they're not going to look kindly on the British and the French coming back and trying to expand their empires in North and South America. And then the Spanish colonies break away and the Portuguese colonies break away from Portugal and Spain, and the Americans tell the Spanish and the Portuguese that they can't come back. The Americans start to chip away at the newly independent Mexico. They annex Texas from Mexico because the Mexicans wanted to end slavery in the Mexican state, and this upset the slave owners who were migrating across the border into northern Mexico and what is Texas, threatening their interests. And so they declared independence from Mexico, and the Americans then annexed Texas and began a war with Mexico and took half of Mexico and added it to the United States as California, Nevada, New Mexico, Utah, Texas, Oklahoma, well, not Oklahoma, Texas, and Arizona. The United States is always interested in trade. It opens up, it forcibly opens up Japan to American trade by threatening to blow up or bomb Japanese ports in 1853. And from a Korean perspective, the Americans would do something similar in 1883 in Korea. 30 years later, they would force the Koreans to open up their ports by fighting a brief war with the Koreans to force Korea to open up its trading. And then the Chinese would encourage the Koreans to trade with the Americans to counterbalance Japan. But that's not really mentioned here. Russia sells, of course, the Americans then fight their civil war. The North wins, as I think most people thought it eventually would. And then America, people pay more attention to the United States. That, okay, the Civil War is over. America, they're going to be a great power. They still have a small military after the Civil War. The military is again reduced in size. And Russia sells Alaska to the United States. Then in 1898, the United States is expanding for more trade and more trade opportunities into the Pacific. As I told you, it becomes involved with the Spanish. It takes Hawaii because Hawaii is weak and they want access to Hawaii as a Navy base so that they can support their Navy and economic interests in Asia. The United States, again, is appearing to stand up to the French and the British and the Germans and the others trying to annex parts of China because they didn't want those countries to get all the economic benefits of dominating and partitioning China. And so you see this expansion. And what I want to highlight is that, again, you see the Americans, they build up their military in the Civil War, and then the Americans win this, the North wins the Civil War, and then the American military is divided and reduced in size. Again, they were a small operation. They get involved in 1917, they enter World War I, they mobilize their military, they institute a draft, and then the war is pretty quickly over, and then the Americans go back home. They take their armies back from Europe and they go back home, and the American military again becomes very small. And then the Americans come to conclude, they don't join the League of Nations at the Treaty of Versailles that ended World War I. They stay involved, but not as certainly anywhere near as assertive as they would be after World War II. And of course, that would be many people that justify and defend American involvement, they say, if America had been involved and stayed actively engaged in Europe after World War I and kept its military bases in Germany and France after World War I, America could have made the Europeans cooperate, or more likely could have motivated the Europeans to cooperate with each other and prevented them from punishing Germany so harshly and prevented the conflicts and promoted cooperation that could have prevented the hostile economic and political policies, foreign policies that contributed to the Great Depression, the rise of it. And that's what if. But that's the justification made today, particularly by neorealists like Kenneth Waltz, that America learned its lessons from leaving Europe after World War I, and this time stayed in Europe and stayed in Asia and prevented World War III, prevented the Soviet Union from trying to do succeeding in doing what Hitler in Germany tried to do. That's the dominant view, that America influence and hegemony is exceptional. America must provide global leadership. America cannot make the mistake that it made in 1920 when it left Europe. No. And America remade Germany and remade Japan in 1945 and made stable, prosperous democracies, supposedly. The Americans can do that in Afghanistan. The Americans can do that in Iraq. They can do that throughout the Middle East. You did it in Germany and Japan. They should be able to do it in Afghanistan. And why? Because America is different from the Russians. America is exceptional. we know what happened. So, this belief in American exceptionalism, that America was destined to expand and bring democracy and capitalism to North America, and of course, this was the balance of power. This is the concert of Europe that I was mentioning earlier, right? You have the United States and Japan are emerging powers, but the concert of Europe, in terms of organizing world affairs, is focused upon these actors after Napoleon is defeated. And that, again, as United Kingdom becomes weaker and weaker and Germany becomes stronger and stronger, that this system becomes unstable because United Kingdom is not so overwhelmingly powerful anymore and is not able to persuade Germany that, if they go to war with the United Kingdom, you're in big trouble. The Germans thought wrongly that they could win. And of course, the terminology in the United States was this: it was America's manifest destiny to expand throughout North America, American exceptionalism. So here you see how America expanded. This was added to the United States as a result of the Independence War. The British agreed to leave. Everything east of the Mississippi went to the United States. So some of you, I don't know if anybody's in American history class, right? But the Americans' colonies located here, they wanted this territory. And they couldn't get it as long as the British forbid them, as part of the British Empire, from taking this territory. So after the British were defeated, the Americans took it. Then the American government purchased this land from France when France, under Napoleon, was preparing for war with the British. And they thought that they needed the money. France, Napoleon needed this money to prepare for war with Britain and maybe defeat Britain. And if the Americans didn't get it, the British up here would take it. They would move in and maybe take it. This is British North America. And this is the Spanish territory that the Americans would then take. And again, gunboat diplomacy. I learned about Admiral Perry going to Japan in 1853 and opening up the Japanese empire to American trade. But again, since we're here in Korea, the Americans did something similar 30 years later in Korea in 1883, engaging in gunboat diplomacy to open up Korea to trade, and American missionaries as well to bring Christianity to promote Protestant Christianity further in Korea. The United States was always actively involved in Central America and Latin America, but that was primarily because of trade and commercial interests. The US had already sent military into the Dominican Republic, Honduras, Cuba, and Panama, but these were weak actors. That doesn't mean that the US had a big military industrial complex. Germany unified in 1871. And the Ottoman Empire was declining, the Russian Empire was in trouble, and the Austrian Empire was in trouble. So the concert of Europe was becoming unstable. And then the First World War, the Americans were not involved at the beginning. And then the Russians finally, after this exhausted from this horrible conflict, they ended hostilities with Germany in 1917. They allowed Germany to annex much of what is European Russia today, and this threatened Woodrow Wilson in the U.S. administration. My God, if Germany wins this war, they're going to dominate all of Europe, and we don't necessarily want them to dominate all of Europe. And so the Americans become involved, and even though they were not a terrible military threat, the Germans knew they couldn't win. If they could not knock out France, and they tried to knock out France in the springtime offensive in 1918, and they failed. And when they failed to knock out France in 1918, and the Americans began to pour into France with their army, including Harry S. Truman as a U.S. captain, the Germans knew they couldn't win, so they surrendered. And so the League of Nations was set up as part of a collective security system. Everybody was supposed to renounce their right to use war as an instrument of foreign policy. States would only use military force in self-defense. These were all official statements. And of course, these official statements would be included in the United Nations after 1945. And then Woodrow Wilson is the president of the United States, and the United States is so overwhelmingly powerful in terms of its capabilities compared to France or exhausted Britain and exhausted other countries, that Woodrow Wilson had a vision which he wanted to promote for a collective security system, but then the US Congress refused to approve the US belonging to the League of Nations. Now, the Americans didn't join the League of Nations, but they were still involved in European diplomacy, but they weren't, they weren't the leading actor. Because first off, they weren't in the League of Nations. Britain was there. And the League of Nations, for example, gave, you would hear lots of references to British Mandate Palestine. They gave the Ottoman territories, because the Ottoman Turkey had been allied with Germany during World War II. Much of the Ottoman territories was mandated by the League of Nations to be under the mandate protection of the British Empire. So the British got what was called British Mandate Palestine. The League of Nations mandated that Britain take over the Ottoman territories of what is today Palestine. And the British made promises to British Jews that they would agree during World War I, if they won the war, to creating a homeland for the Jews. And that would be the beginning of the establishment of the State of Israel under the British Mandate Palestine. There were other mandate territories, like Namibia was given to German Southwest Africa was given to South Africa, and it stayed under South African control until the 1990s. Okay, so but the U.S. was involved, but they weren't a leading actor. The British came up with some bright idea for the 1928 Kellogg-Briand Pact that outlawed war. This, again, Kellogg was the US Secretary of State. Briand was the French foreign minister. Yes, Kellogg cornflakes, that's that same family. And the 62 countries signed this. And of course, this would be the basis for putting the leaders of Germany and Japan on trial after World War II for war crimes. So they violated the Kellogg-Briand Pact. The people mock or laugh at the League of Nations. It wasn't as ineffective as some people have portrayed. Mussolini comes to power in Italy, and he wants to be an empire builder for Italy. And so he conquers Ethiopia in 1935. And the League of Nations put sanctions on Italy, economic sanctions on Italy for conquering Ethiopia. And these economic sanctions really hurt the Italian economy. They were a really costly penalty on Italy. And would they have forced the Italians to leave Ethiopia? We don't know, but they were having an effect. But then after Hitler came to power, and Hitler started making demands on Austria to unify the German people of Austria with the Reich, the British and the French decided they need to cooperate with Italy to stop Germany from annexing Austria. Of course, they didn't stop Germany from annexing Austria, but they thought they needed to work more closely with Mussolini in Italy to oppose Germany absorbing Austria. So they took the sanctions off Italy, even though the sanctions were having a major impact on the Italian economy. So the US military is small. Germany goes to war under Hitler with all of Western Europe. And Franklin Delano Roosevelt was the president, and he wanted to fight World War II, but he couldn't just make America go into World War II. Like Wilson, he understood that, that if the Germans won this war, it would be a bad situation for the United States. So he supported Britain and unofficially fought a Navy war to supply the British using the American Navy. And the Americans begin to build up their military, but still it's not a big military. And he stated in 1940, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, when he was running for president, that the US would not enter the war, but then the Japanese in their overestimation of their power capabilities, made the US entry into the war a lot easier by bombing the US when the US was putting sanctions on the Japanese economy for Japan's invasion of China. So the Americans were putting economic sanctions on Japan, which were really, really costly to the Japanese economy. And so the Japanese decided that they'd try to knock the Americans out of the Pacific by at least the Pacific around Japan, by destroying the American Navy in Pearl Harbor. And 3 days later, Hitler and Mussolini declare war on the United States, which, you know, Franklin Delano Roosevelt probably said, "Thank you, God," because it allowed the US to go to war with Germany and Italy, along with Japan, because I told you, nation states are more prone to overestimate their power capabilities. They think they can do amazing things, like Germany conquering the world. So Germany and Italy declare war on the United States. They didn't have to. They just did, because Japan attacked the United States, and Japan's their ally. Which you can say, what if the Germans had jettisoned the Japanese and said, "Oh, these Japanese attacked another European culture, society, America. We are going to stand with our fellow Aryan leaders in the United States against Asian racists." If he had done something like that, would the world situation have been different? I don't know. But the point is that 3 days after the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor in December 7, 1941, Mussolini and Hitler declare war on US. And so the US said, okay, and they fought this war on two different fronts while they're not being able to be attacked. And then the US begins to develop the nuclear bombs, partly because they're afraid that the Germans might get them first. The Germans surrender, and then the Americans develop the bombs and then use them against the Japanese in Hiroshima and Nagasaki and kill many tens of thousands of people. And then I told you, as the war was over, Japan surrendered, and the Americans began to dismantle their military. They kept occupation forces in Japan, but they were just small level forces. They relied upon the Japanese to run their affairs, while MacArthur pretended to be, you know, the figurehead of the American occupation. But they still relied upon the Japanese military, the Japanese government, the Japanese aristocracy, the Japanese emperor, the Japanese bureaucracy. And when the North Koreans attacked the South Korea, the Americans moved the occupation forces from Japan into South Korea. And that's when the Americans rebuilt their military and decided they had to fight a worldwide Cold War against the nuclear-armed Soviet Union that was a Russian version of Nazi Germany, except it has nuclear weapons as well, because the Soviet Union developed nuclear weapons and tested them in 1949. So the Americans fought this Cold War, and that brings us to where we are today. The Americans and the Soviets had to avoid going to war with each other because it would be mutual suicide, right? With nuclear weapons. So they fought their wars indirectly in Korea, in Vietnam, overtly, sometimes covertly, everywhere around the world. The KGB and the CIA were involved in competitive interference in all of the countries of the world, in Italy, in Philippines, in the countries of Latin America. That's how you fight nuclear war. You can't go to war with your enemy. You have to compete, and sometimes viciously compete for influence in third countries. And you can always find local clients in those third countries who are begging you to help them. Please, please help us, Americans, against our enemies, because you know, America, those enemies of ours, they're communists. They're working for Stalin. Oh, and America would go, oh, yes, we'll help you. And of course, those enemies of the local clients in America would appeal to the Soviet Union for help. This happened everywhere. This happened in Greece and Italy. It happened in Iran. It happened throughout Africa and the Middle East. It happened in Latin America during the Cold War. Keep in mind, millions of innocent people died. Millions died in the Cold War. It was cold for, America and the Soviet Union. They would get involved in Vietnam and lose soldiers there, but millions of people died in places like Korea and Vietnam during the Cold War, the so-called Cold War. And so, why was the Soviet Union belligerent? Why was Stalin a nasty guy in adopting belligerent policies in Eastern Europe? And of course, as I told you, the dominant view in the US was Stalin and the Soviet Union were belligerent in Europe and elsewhere because they wanted to do what Hitler failed to do. Others say, well, Stalin was paranoid. Stalin believed that, that the Americans and the United States and the British were inherently anti-communist because they're capitalists. Germany had invaded Russian territory twice in World War I and World War II. 27 million people died in the Soviet Union during World War II. And the Americans were not really interested in coming to a cooperation agreement with what to do with Germany at the end of World War II. And so as the Americans began to move forward in stabilizing Western Germany, the Soviet Union moved to stabilize Eastern Germany. And that's an important point that Hook makes. Stalin had no interest in withdrawing from the region that twice in his lifetime has served as a staging area for German invasions. So Hook, the author of your book, has a more ambiguous view about why the Soviet Union was belligerent in Eastern Europe. But at the time, people like George Kennan and others were arguing, nope, Stalin and the Soviet Union are expanding because they see an opportunity to do that. And they want to do what the Russians have always wanted to do, which is expand into Eastern Europe, control access to, get access to so-called warm water ports, dominate get access to the Pacific, the Indian and Mediterranean oceans. They've always wanted to do that, and they think they can do it because Europe is weak and divided after World War II. And so you see a chronology of the Cold War, and but the point is that the Soviet, and you hear these same words being spoken today, and we're running out of time here, maybe about, just to conclude, that the United States, the Soviet Union had to expand, that the nature of the totalitarian Soviet system was such that if it did not expand its power and influence around the world, it could not survive, because it was a brutal, cruel system that relied upon providing imperial glory and pride to the Soviet people by dominating the world. And if it could not expand, it could not maintain control of its people because of the costs of maintaining that cruel system in the Soviet Union. You had to provide them with glory. And you hear the same words being spoken by some regarding China, that China must expand because the totalitarian one-party state in China cannot stay in power unless it delivers glory and grandeur to the Chinese nation as the benefit of paying the price of one-party totalitarian control. You hear that? I just heard that last week from somebody in the media. So maybe we should do an exercise to get some kind of credit for participation, to note who participated today. So we go to vote. And so do you think American soft power, America has a global power advantage over China because it is a democracy and it's capitalist? And so please vote. I mean, America is a diverse, immigrant-based national community. I mean, how many Koreans have family in the United States and friends? How much of the world comes to the United States to make money and make a better life for themselves? And this is something that really appeals to the world, even including to Afghanistan people. I mean, the Taliban, they don't want to be poor. Everybody wants to be prosperous, if not just for themselves, for their nation. So please vote.
Yeah, I'm still doing it, but it's not really loading.
Let me see. Is it loading now?
Yeah, okay, it's completed. Thank you.
Keep voting. Oh, I think that's everybody. That's right. 6, 7, 8. So 2 more people need to vote before we hit the time limit. One more person. Okay, that's it for today's class then. And we are at 11:50. So I will stop the share and I'll post these recordings on the website. Okay, so any questions? If not, 안녕히 하세요.